Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge Company. The byline by Sam Roberts is one of our city's most valuable possessions. He knows the city better than anyone I know, and he can write about any neighborhood because he knows how it developed and how it's changed. He can tell us who comes from it and the schools and religious institutions they attended. He puts so much life into the city and so much love, and he's my guest today.
Thank you, Ronnie.
You know?
Well, in Brooklyn, they ask you what school you went to, and in Queens, they ask what parish you belong
to. Right, exactly. I don't know what they ask on the West Side. I think we still ask what school.
Which private school you went to?
No, I never went to.
No, not you.
So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Brooklyn. We called it East Flatbush then, but it was really Brownsville, and went to public school, went to Tilden High School then, and then for my only extended stay out of New York City, went to college.
Yeah. And what's the neighborhood like when you go back there now?
It is not all that different. I mean, it was always a lower middle class sort of blue collar neighborhood, and it's much the same now. The big difference is then it was 99-point-something% Jewish, and now it's 90% Caribbean.
So interesting, isn't it, how these neighborhoods have changed?
Well, it is, and you know, as you well know, almost every neighborhood in the city goes through a metamorphosis, and it's so fascinating to sit and think, what will come next? You know, what is the next evolution of it? What's the next incarnation of a neighborhood? And all the forces that come into play in deciding that, and a lot of them, of course, tend to relate to real estate prices, to rents, and what people can afford. And as soon as you have pioneers in the neighborhood, the rent goes up and they can't afford to stay anymore.
So what's going to happen is what? Poor people are going to move out.
Yeah.
Not even into the close suburbs, but further out.
Well, which is in part what's happening. Now, what you see is more diversity in the suburbs, and one of the reasons for it is the suburbs have become somewhat more welcoming, and in part not out of choice. They have become much more diverse than they ever were. They're sort of mirroring the city in many respects.
Yeah. So the census was out. You know, the census, we should tell everybody, I'm sure by now they know, but it's done every 10 years, right?
Well, the census is done every 10 years, but now what we have every 10 years is what amounts to the short form. And what we have every year is the American Community Survey.
Which is a trove of information.
It is great. It is, you know.
Is that new?
It is new. It started within the last decade and has been phased in. And last December, for the first time, it was released in terms of every tract and block in the city. So again, the sample is not quite as big as the census, but this was a 5-year sample from 2005 through 2009.
So you could see each year.
You could see each year, and you could also see cumulatively, so you had a sense that this was pretty right.
Now, the census is just the number of people living in a household?
Census is number, age, race, ethnicity, and that's about it, whether they're group quarters or not. And what this census found that just came out last month was that New York had about almost 8.2 million people. That's a record for the city, but it is a little less than city officials had expected.
It's not the fastest growing increase in population in cities around the 10 major cities.
No, and in fact, when you look at metropolitan areas, New York was the slowest growing of any of the top 10. But it also added more people than all but 3 cities in the entire United States.
What cities? What, down south and west?
I can make it up, but I'll look it up. It was Fort Worth, Charlotte, and San Antonio. And New York was fourth, adding about 160,000 people in the past 10 years.
What's the difference between the city and the greater metropolitan area?
Well, that depends on your definition. The city, obviously, the 5 boroughs. Greater metropolitan area can just be the adjoining counties, or the metropolitan statistical area, as the census defines it, goes all the way to the Poconos, into Connecticut, way like halfway down into New Jersey and Pennsylvania.
Is that the 19 counties that are in it?
I think it is 19 counties.
Exactly. But it's good that it goes to the Poconos, because it seems to me the Poconos, I don't know what showed up on this.
Well, what showed up there,
population.
Just as you say, is about the fastest growing population. And one of the things you see in the city did not grow as fast as it did during the 1990s. You could argue that's in part the aftermath of 9/11, the recession, fewer people coming to this country from overseas because the reason they come is for jobs. If the jobs aren't here, they don't come. But the fastest growing places, as you say, were the outlying suburbs. Now, part of that is they start with a smaller base, so percentage-wise, they tend to grow faster. But the Bronx grew by 52,000 people, And if you go up to the Bronx, you see there's hardly a vacant lot anymore. They keep dumping these, you know, two-family, three-family houses into every little space, and people clearly seem to be buying them.
Was the era from the 80s to the 90s that had the biggest decline?
It had some of the biggest decline, 70s to 80s.
70s to 80s.
70s to 80s. And what you have now, it's very interesting. You have now, for the first time since the Civil War, a decline in the black population. Slight, but a decline. Now, you can think of that as poor people being driven out. That is in part true. It's also that the South is a lot more receptive to some of them, and they want to go where the jobs are in places like Charlotte and Atlanta. Also, the suburbs more receptive, so people can move there. The fastest growing group were Asians, something like 38% in the past 10 years. Hispanic people somewhat slower, but increasing. And for the first time, you know, since, you know, white flight started from the city in the middle of the 20th century, only about, and I'll look down to see this number so I get it right, only about 31,000 decline in non-Hispanic white people in the city in the past 10 years, compared to 10 times that figure in the 10 years preceding.
And yet, it's the first time also that the majority of the people in the city are non-white.
Well, the first time the majority in the metropolitan area are non-white.
And not in the city too? Or the city's almost even?
Well, the city turned about in the last decade or so. But now the metropolitan area, and what's interesting is there is no metropolitan area except New York in the entire country, except in the South and the West, in which minorities, so-called, make up a majority of the population.
But at the same time, what they say is right about it's racial, I mean, it's the discrimination, racial discrimination as far as housing goes.
Well, segregation is improved a little bit. And these are things that are hard to measure, but statisticians have all sorts of formulas to figure this out. It improved a little bit in the past 10 years, but it is still among the highest in the country.
I think I read that it surpassed Detroit and Chicago.
I think it is higher than Detroit and Chicago.
It's behind Milwaukee, which is a city you would never think of.
Exactly.
And, so funny.
You know, it's part of, and of course, black-white segregation is what is most prominent. Hispanic people, Asians have a little bit better job of integrating. And what you're finding, though, is the suburbs becoming more integrated as well, as more people move there.
What's interesting to me is also the Latina, the Hispanic group. It's the Puerto Ricans are less than the Dominicans and the Mexicans combined, right?
Yeah, well, it's really amazing.
So it's so interesting to see all these different...
You see that influx in the 40s and 50s of people from Puerto Rico. They are, of course, considered citizens. But now you've got a vast influx from the Dominican Republic and Mexico. In fact, among the number of babies born in the city, more are now born to Mexican parents than Dominican parents. And what you're finding is these clusters of Mexicans in various places. You can tell by the menus that get slipped under your doors. That, to me, is the best indication of how a neighborhood is changing, what the metamorphosis is. And you also see Dominicans moving out of Washington Heights, jumping over into the Bronx and other places. And that is all part of the revitalization of the city. Those neighborhoods are all, you know, vibrant.
So where do the poor people go? Do they go south? They go back to where they came from? Where do poor people go?
Well,
is there a way to tell?
First of all, of course, we have to define what is poor, and that's difficult enough. But the poor people are the ones who are least likely to be mobile. Well, it depends. The city under the Bloomberg administration, frankly, has a much better definition than the feds do. It takes into account things like tax credits, food stamps, Medicaid. It also takes into account the added costs of daycare, of transportation, of medical costs, things like that. And so there are, in fact, more people in the city poor under the Bloomberg administration's definition than under the federal definition. A lot of them stay put. A lot of them, of course, in public housing. There are some vast number of them that are counted as homeless people in this city, a number that keeps going up in spite of lots of efforts to deal with that. But you do see neighborhoods gentrifying. You see poor Jews and Poles in Williamsburg being displaced by yuppies, artists,
we went to Williamsburg. We were older than everybody combined.
It's remarkable. And, you know, who would have wanted 10 or 15 years ago to live in Williamsburg, given a choice? Well, it's a lot cheaper than even the Lower East Side, or especially Soho, or the Village.
Well, the Lower East Side also is gentrified. That's
totally.
And then the younger couples move out to Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And then the people who lived in Brooklyn have to move someplace else.
Exactly. My son moved to a house in Carroll Gardens, and that used to be a predominantly Italian neighborhood, a little bit Irish too as you got more toward Bay Ridge, Bensonhurst, Red Hook, but it's becoming a gentrified neighborhood. And again, you can tell. I don't want to, become obsessed with eating, but you can tell by the restaurants, which is such a fascinating barometer of ethnicity in any neighborhood.
It is. It's totally, when you think about it, it's incredible. When I grew up, I grew up on the West Side, and between Broadway and Central Park was all Irish. And then that was taken, then the Puerto Ricans came, right? And now they're all expensive brownstones or fixed up, old apartment buildings, and the rents are prohibitive. So it's that whole evolution.
Yeah, except for some of the public housing or subsidized housing, that's absolutely true. And of course, you see more and more land being created. You see the projects all the way on the West Side, west of Lincoln Center, and they are anything but affordable to most people.
So what's happening with housing? Do we show any figures in here about new construction?
What's interesting is the population, according to the city, went up 106. According to the census, went up 160,000.
But they didn't like that.
They didn't like that, and my guess is that was an undercount for several reasons. Places in foreclosure, places that might have been overbuilt and were still vacant, foreigners who only spend a limited amount of time in the city, and people like poor people, illegal immigrants who were by nature harder to count, living in illegally doubled up or tripled up or converted apartments, and the Census Bureau couldn't find them. Now, what they also found, though, were 170,000 additional apartments since 2000. Now, they classified many of those as vacant, but that's an awful lot of housing to go up in 10 years. Not enough, but a lot.
But is that including luxury housing as well as?
Absolutely.
There's no distinction between them?
No.
So you're not able to tell what kind of housing?
There are other ways of telling. They do a housing and vacancy survey, which actually is going to be done again this year, which I think will give us a much better idea. But the census...
Who does that?
It is done by the Census Bureau for the city.
And does the city, the landlords like it or not like it?
Well, they like it if it shows that the vacancy rate is so low that they can,
charge whatever they want.
Exactly, or do away with rent regulations.
Or
if it's high, they can do away with rent regulations.
Right, so they get it either way.
Right.
Does it tell us the number of families, the marriages, people living together? Well, single people?
It does. This is still, a disproportionately single-person city. Two reasons. One, there are a lot of young people who still are attracted here, many who live alone, although lots can't afford to, they need roommates, and also a lot of elderly people, either widows, widowers, who also live alone. So those two things sort of skew the composition of housing in the city, the size of families, and it's probably lower than it would be. One other thing that skews the statistics in New York is the number of immigrants. If it weren't for immigrants, this would be a much older city.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask about births.
Yeah.
Have the births gone up, down, stayed
the
same?
The births, it depends which group you look at. If you look at non-Hispanic whites, the births are down. If you look at every group, generally, the births are down. And that is true as immigrants become acclimated to the country. They have higher birth rates when they get here, higher fertility rates. They come sometimes with more children. That is certainly true of Hispanic, to a lesser extent Asian people. But even their birth rates are going down. And what you find is the highest birth rates, not surprisingly, among the newest immigrants, like Mexicans.
So is there any way to judge the number? You have a lot of young people here because they love the excitement and the jobs and everything else. But as they get older, do they move out?
Well, some do. And one of the things
do we have a way of knowing that?
Well, you do, because there are ways of tracking that. There's IRS data. There are census questions that say, where did you live a year ago, or where did you live 5 years ago? So you can get some measure of that. It's not precise. But what you've always had is this sort of churning of the city that Joe Salvo at City Planning likes to call it. You have people coming and going constantly. There are very few people who move to the city and spend the rest of their lives here. There are relatively few who are born here and spend the rest of their lives here, besides you and me. But a lot of people come and go. What you find even among immigrants now is some of them coming to the city, staying briefly, and then moving on to the suburbs or moving off to literally the middle of America. Or you're finding some that are leapfrogging the city and going directly to the suburbs.
Okay. Is there a way to tell how many of the older people leave to go to other places?
Yes.
Did Florida increase in their population?
No, it did not. And there are a couple of reasons for that. You know, you can look and say, oh, more people stayed in the city. Isn't that a good thing? And maybe that's because the city is safer and the city is more attractive. The answer to that is yes, it is. But there's another side to it. I think it's partly people whose 401ks were wiped out and couldn't afford to retire, and people who have homes that they bought and are now more or less empty nests, and they couldn't sell them in this market. So they stayed in the city, whereas they might have left for North Carolina or Florida or Arizona.
But isn't it interesting that we are also undergoing all kinds of programming to make the city more livable for older people?
And that's why a fascinating thing is occurring. And again, it's a little early to quantify it, but there are people moving back from the South.
city.
There are people not only from the suburbs, but people who retired in the South who are coming back and saying, the medical care is better here, the public transportation is surely better here. You can stay in your apartment and order in, and you can see a lot of your family, your kids, your grandkids who are still around. And it's becoming more attractive.
It makes such common sense to stay here.
Yeah, when you think
should
of
leave
where
it
to
when
retire.
you're younger.
Yeah.
You know, I'd like to leave sometime. I'd like to know what it's like, but it's no time anymore.
Well, you'd want to leave and come back.
Right,
And the problem, you know, some people find the weather can be onerous, and of course it can, but hurricanes and earthquakes and mudslides and forest fires are not great either.
I think the Academy of Medicine and the Department for the Aging, the city are all, they're doing a lot of things to make the city better for older people.
As well they should, because in fact, as is true in the rest of the United States, the median age is climbing up. It's still, as I say, lower here than in many other places because of immigration, those newer immigrants keeping the rate down. First, because they're younger when they come here, and secondly, because they're more likely to have children than the native born, so they keep the median age down. But there are going to be numerically and proportionately more and more older people in the city.
And that's partly because we live longer.
Exactly.
Right.
No question.
Because of the stuff. So what do you think is the future? What's going to happen?
Well, I'm optimistic. I don't think we'll grow, at least in the immediate future, as fast as we suggested we would. But there are going to be, at this rate, 9 million people in the city in, you know, the 2020s or thereabouts. And what we've got to do is, you know, not realize that growth is good for the sake of growth, but realize how we should shape this city, accommodate this city to that growth. Who the people are going to be, what their needs are, as in the elderly and others, students coming in. The population in dormitories in this city in the past 10 years has skyrocketed, a great thing. There were probably more people going to college here than any other place in the country.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, you know, I think there are great reasons for optimism.
And the number of hotels, so it means the number of visitors that come here.
Exactly.
But when we talk, you said that there's somebody at the City Planning Commission that does a lot of these figures and figuring it out. How is that put into the planning for the future, or is it? I mean, is the MTA look at this and instead of doing more, I mean, they'll do subways and stuff, but are they also going to look at surface transportation because the city is going to get older? What are we going to do?
It's very rare that the city has been able to plan for the future. It did it somewhat under the Lindsay administration, its plan, 1969 plan. It did a little bit under the Koch administration with Bobby Wagner. It's certainly doing it under the Bloomberg administration with the Plan 2030, Plan NYC 2030. And it's a luxury because usually in tough times you can barely get through the day, much less plan for something 10 or 20 years from now. But it's really vital because otherwise by then it's too late to do anything. One of the things we're planning, people never see it, is the third water tunnel to make sure we have enough water. It's something we obviously take for granted, but very important. Finally building some new subways. They're, you know, totally inadequate to the need, but at least we are building subways. You know, the Second Avenue subway was proposed well before 1950 and is long overdue. And we need to deal with, you know, bus transportation and with bus lanes and cameras and articulated buses and things like that. They are trying, you know, Jay Walder and others trying to improve and speed bus transportation. It's almost intractable, but they seem to be making some progress.
Now, the political ramifications for this are, so Manhattan and Brooklyn increase their population.
Yes.
Right? And the Bronx and Queens and Staten Island did, even with the migration?
Well, there was some increase, but not enormous. And it's also interesting when you look at sort of a racial equilibrium in this city. Brooklyn and Manhattan were the only counties over 1 million people in the entire United States where the white population increased. And, you know, I think it's a little early to say that we have reached a period of stabilization, of equilibrium, but it seems that we're close to that, that we are one of the very few cities anywhere that in which nobody is a majority.
Yeah,
you've got California cities that are very, and Texas cities that are very heavily Hispanic, other places that are more Asian. We're not exactly, you know, in quarters, but pretty close.
And Queens has become more Asian than Chinatown.
Queens now has more Asians than Chinatown,
Right.
indeed,
What was
proportionately and otherwise. And it's very funny because we did a chart in the paper not long ago, and we found that Queens Village was probably the most diverse census tract in the city. Equal numbers of immigrants from almost everywhere. And Breezy Point, perhaps not surprisingly, also in Queens, about the least diverse. Almost everyone there were American-born, Irish, and Italian.
Yeah, there's a great Hugh Carey story, but I won't say it. But one of the things that surprised me was that New York City, is it the longest commute to work?
It is.
And is that because of the expansion? Is it the city or the metropolitan area?
It's the city, and you're right. I mean, those numbers are all kind of skewed sometimes. One of the reasons is the city is so big. Yeah. One of the reasons is we're dependent on public transportation so much. We use public transportation more than any city in the country, certainly. And people live farther from work. There's more commuting into that downtown hub for the most part. But more and more you see people commuting not just to downtown, but commuting within their own borough or a neighboring borough or even out of the city.
As we spread the businesses and stuff like that. I was a little troubled. It seemed to me, I read in one of the articles or something, that, is it Brooklyn also, but the people in Manhattan, they have the highest percentage of bachelor's degrees from college?
I think that is correct. I forget the exact figure, but yes.
So
but when you look at education in this city in just the past 10 years, as measured by degrees, not measured by intelligence, which is harder to quantify, it is skyrocketed. It has really gone up. Certainly high school diplomas have gone up, but bachelor's degrees, and I think a lot of that, frankly, is the result of City University.
Yeah. But is there a way to look at the problems that we have in schools? Does the Department of Education look at these census? I mean, how do they locate schools? That's one of the major problems, isn't it?
This is the way they should locate schools.
Right, by looking at the
census. Looking at the census and also looking at transportation, because people always tended to move where the transit routes are. If you can't get from where you're going to work or to school or to play, then what's the point of living there?
Right.
So that's, in terms of their planning, that's precisely what they should be looking at.
I remember once early on, one of the problems with daycare centers was that they were built in areas where they were needed at the time, but because of all the moving around and everything, there was nobody in that area to fill them, so we had empty centers, but we had too many children who couldn't be accommodated.
Right, now we have OTB parlors that are empty.
That's right. So what do we do with those?
Well, make them daycare centers? I'm not sure. But if we own them, most of them I assume we rent, we ought to find something to do or at least get out of the leases.
So have we skipped any important, interesting things?
I think you've covered it pretty well.
Well, how did you come to be so interested in all of this?
The truth, like any writer, I was late on a project and I told my editor, who I was doing a book for, that I've been doing all these exciting stories on the census, and he said, well, maybe there's a book there. And so I began to, delve into the census a little more and found all sorts of fascinating things. It is a gold mine. It's filled with rich veins and also nuggets of information. And the numbers, of course, just a starting point, but it tells a lot about a place.
And does it mean, is it necessary for a New Yorker to really know the New York, understand what's going on in New York? I mean, I think it's an extra bonus, isn't it, that you grew up here?
I think so, but we are so consumed by the present that we may delve, as we said, a little bit into the future. We don't think enough of the past, and when you think of what's happening in New York as a continuum, we are in the middle of something. We know sort of where it started. We don't know where it's going to end. It gives us a much better perspective that so many of the problems we're wrestling with, so many of the controversies we've been through before.
Nothing new.
That doesn't mean we should wallow in the fact and say, well, we'll get over it, but we should go back and look at some of the solutions and get a little better perspective.
You wrote about the person who mapped the grid. That was fascinating, and that started very early.
It was in 1811, and John Randell Jr. mapped Manhattan up to 155th Street at a time when virtually nobody was living above Houston Street. And the prescience of doing this, and you know, people laughed, why you're doing it. But what it did, for better or for worse, mostly better, was establish a predictability to the real estate market. People knew where the roads were, knew where the plots of land were. The city began selling off a lot of its common-owned land in those areas and made some money, and people were able to build.
It's so interesting that that happened so early.
And
how did he do that? Was he hired to do that?
He was hired by a commission created by the state because the city thought it would be too subject to pressures from landlords and property owners to do it itself. And he went out and over a number of years mapped block by block by block all over the city. Was attacked, you know, with cabbages by landlords, various other things. But made it.
They should like it. Now, how did they map the subway routes?
That was a problem because, you know, it was not in my backyard or not under my backyard. A lot of the store owners didn't want the L lines going right by their places. And then they tried to put the subway routes, at least initially, where they thought they were going to be used most. And the first one is the one that went up, starting in Broadway, sort of up the east side, looped over to the west side, and it's sort of the five taking the shuttle and becoming the two or the three.
So I wish we could continue this, but
well,
we're coming
I'll come
to
back.
the end. Well, you must come back, and I wanted to talk about your one of the books you wrote and how it continues to add more information as time goes on when the characters reveal different things or they die or something else. Do you know what am I talking about?
Which one? Oh, the Rosenbergs,
right,
the brother.
Yes.
Yes. Well, it's fascinating. I try not to make a career out of that issue, but it really is a fascinating
It's worth. We have to talk about it.
Okay, we'll do it.
All right. Thank you so much, Sam Roberts.
Thanks for inviting me.
You. Is there any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore? Please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.